Okay, next up, news in terms of neural rendering, in terms of neural texture compression. And Alex, what's going on there? A paper. There has been a paper. Am I right?
Yes, this is a new, I would say, addendum to previous techniques that NVIDIA has been developing for quite some time now. We started reporting on it probably in like 2022. And the whole idea is inferencing textures instead of loading them up from disk as a defined texture format, like block compression format that runs natively on the GPU. And the reason why you'd want to do this, we saw demos of this, Oliver and I, at CES, where you could have very highly detailed, complex textures, layered textures with many different facets on them. Instead of them existing as a discrete, expensive, and heavy format that needs to go from the disk over PCIe onto the GPU, it's represented as a lightweight neural representation, which is then inferenced in real time at a cost on the tensor cores, and brought into a high resolution format that has a lot less VRAM being used. The demos that NVIDIA showed off, I think, we're touting something like 1/8 the texture usage, texture space usage than you would see in a traditional block compressed format. The issue with some of those demos that Oliver and I saw at CES, as well as just a general problem with the technique, is that it couldn't leverage hardware texture filtering in a good way. You could filter the texture manually, but it would then become a lot more expensive. So what they did is instead they had the texture be stochastically sampled, and they would allow it to be integrated over time by using something like TAA or DLSS in their case, or DLAA. And that is interesting, but as you can imagine, that has a lot of problems. It would work, but you could start seeing kind of like noise break up within textures, which is something we've kind of gotten away from in games since texture filtering was invented. You would start seeing like almost like ray tracing looking noise in just a normal, even rasterized texture, right? In that case, that was a big problem area, and that was kind of an unavoidable thing, and it made it look like the technique wouldn't see any good usage in real time for the foreseeable future. But this new paper called Collaborative Texture Filtering that has just come out very recently kind of changes this by allowing texture filtering to be done on the GPU in a way that uses GPU intrinsics. Basically, as introduced in DirectX 12, you can have a more low-level approach to splitting up how the lanes on a GPU are being utilized, and it can be done in a GPU-specific fashion. And this makes it so that the resources on the GPU are being utilized much better than they would have been before without using intrinsics. And this paper makes it so there's some really cool video that they provide as part of the paper where they show their technique versus, like, you can see in the top right-hand corner, there's the stochastically sampled one. I think they label it as STP. You'll see that there's basically really good filtering on these textures now with none of that noise and breakup. And the cost, due to the way they're doing it, where it's not having to overdo work, essentially, it's a lot better and a lot more performant than it was before, potentially could have been. So this is really great for the future of real-time rendering, because this seemed like some sort of step that, like a boundary that needed to be crossed at some point. And it's going to mean really big differences in our games in probably the next 3 to 5 years, depending upon what ends up happening. Because now AMD, Intel, and NVIDIA, as of, I think, at the end of August, I think AMD might be shipping their cooperative vector driver, which is basically the ability to use machine learning hardware in the GPU in a normal shader in DirectX. Intel supports it right now, NVIDIA supports it, but AMD is also going to support it very soon with RDNA 4. And after that moment, and as more of these GPUs start being sold, all the NVIDIA GPUs already support it, but all the AMD ones are going to start supporting as well very soon. We're going to start maybe seeing either massive texture savings in games or decidedly lower bandwidth usage from getting things off of disk onto the GPU. And this will mean higher texture quality. it means a lot of things. Then there's a lot of other use cases for this. But this paper is really, I think, impressive and cool because we're going to start seeing the usage of machine learning hardware for things that are other than image reconstruction or frame generation. Games so far have primarily used it for that. We've seen some movement in other directions with like neural, what is it called? Neural radiance caching from NVIDIA. It's really only been shown in the Half-Life 2 RTX demo. But here we're going to start seeing games textures actually being inferenced in real time at a higher quality and potentially lower VRAM usage than they've possibly ever been in the past, just for a small hit on performance when using something like a Tensor Core. And I think this is an amazing step forward, and I'm really excited to see what it brings out next, because this paper, I think, shows that some of the issues with this can be solved, and it makes it so much more viable as something we'll start seeing maybe in the next 3 to 5 years. And especially now that something like the next Xbox is presumably going to support similar technologies like this, well, things are looking really bright in real-time rendering. But I just wanted to show this on the channel because we talked about this before, and I kind of said, oh, this is like music of the future, something that seems like a really cool idea, but there's practical implementation issues at the moment with it. And now inferencing a texture in real time doesn't have nearly as many downsides as it had just a year ago. So it's going to be happening, and I'm just very curious to see how it's brought about first and like what the first title would be.
Interesting. I mean, is it compatible with legacy systems for texturing? Because obviously the issue is maybe you'd need to be shipping 2 sets of textures or 2 sets of texture data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you would presumably, if the game didn't want to have a hard cutoff, it would have an option where it would sit. Well, 2 sets of texture data is not the same thing, because this is a neural weight representation of a texture. It's much lighter by its very existence. Mm-hmm. It's not shipping 2 of the same textures in different formats, rather a representation of a texture that is much smaller. In that case, it makes it much more viable actually than shipping 2 different types of texture formats than a normal game would. And presumably it would be a hardware elected option that the game starts with or the user selects in the menu. Because there still would be trade-offs with it. It potentially will affect performance in a different way and a different aspect of the GPU than usual textures like bandwidth and PCIe bandwidth. But I think this is actually pretty cool and more viable than a lot of the other demos we've seen in the past. Like the neural, for example, the neural materials demo we saw was really cool, but that also had high costs in some aspects that still have yet to be solved. But this is awesome, and I'm really excited to see where it comes to.
Nice. I think, from my perspective, obviously we need to move on from the 8GB GPU. I think it's pretty much, it's not good. But at the same time, the concept of just being able to double up on memory generation after generation after generation, it's not going to happen. Let's be brutally honest about it. The cost implications are just makes it unviable. So obviously, and it's a similar thing is going to be happening with quote unquote performance, where there are going to be machine learning based solutions that step in to sort of make up for the fact that you can't have that step change in hardware anymore. I mean, if you think back to, particularly to the jump from the PS3 to the PS4, it was like 8 times the memory from one generation to the next.
Right.
Those days are well behind us at this point. So it is about making use of what we've got more efficiently, right? And if there's also a quality benefit from doing so via machine learning, I just think that's just fantastic. I think honestly we are on the sort of DLSS frame generation. Those are just the beginning, right? There's going to be a whole lot more going on. For the same reason, right? You can't continue to scale up your GPUs. You can't double up your GPU gen on gen anymore, and machine learning is going to step in to make up some of the gulf there. So really interesting to see what other stuff we're going to be seeing. Any thoughts on this, Oliver?
No, just to say that it looks like almost perfect bilinear texture filtering. That's at least how it appears. And the quality is pretty similar to hardware texture filtering. I mean, in these comparisons, It looks very, very similar to that ground truth they have there. So that's quite compelling. Also, I mean, I skimmed through the paper, but it seems, at least to me, seems production viable with the cost they're quoting. So that's really exciting, and that's really compelling, I think, especially relative to some of the other NVIDIA tech demos that we've seen, like at CES, where, like Alex said, the tech is interesting, but maybe it's not quite as production ready, not quite as cheap necessarily. And also there isn't necessarily a good fallback or a good alternative for devices that don't support it. In this case, you could just ship a separate set of textures using separate kinds of texture compression, separate kinds of methods there. But in other cases, maybe if you're building a game around like neural materials, what is your non-neural material representation for that kind of thing, right? Like there are all kinds of production hurdles that might end up coming into play with some of those other techniques that presumably, if this is implemented as it seems it could be, wouldn't come into play with this technique.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's going to also be interesting because it represents like a different way. We're always used to getting like really big data off of our SSDs onto GPU memory. And on consoles, that's also an issue where they had to come up with a discrete decompression block to mainly the biggest thing in games these days is textures by far. And getting all that data onto disk, getting out from disk into memory is like the whole reason the PS5 SSD subsystem exists. But this kind of thing makes large parts of that completely redundant and unnecessary. So it's a very interesting way. I'm very curious to see like what this means for the future of hardware design, even on the console space, because you won't necessarily need to keep increasing SSD speed. It doesn't really bring much more to the table if you don't need to bring such excessive amounts of data, and it's just being procedurally generated on the GPU then in the future. So I really wonder what the next Xbox and PS6 are going to look like in terms of how much more memory they have, as well as do they even need to increase the speed of these SSDs? Like they're already pretty darn fast. Like, I wonder.
It's definitely all about machine learning, and when Microsoft is talking about the biggest technological leap ever in a generation, it's not going to be because they've got a gigantic GPU on there. It's going to be because there's a new frontier of quote unquote power, and it is going to be coming from machine learning. And I guess that ties into the bigger history, which is what actually is UDNA from AMD. What is the makeup of that particular architecture?